In the next hour or so, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the work we've been doing at Tahoe, but it's really a collaborative piece of work. And some of the photos that I've placed into this work or this presentation are actually available in the books in the back. So do go by the desk in the back and look at some of the great books that you see there from a both historical and cultural aspect for Lake Tahoe. So I'm starting to kind of come back full circle in my career to remind myself of why Tahoe is such a gem. And then it dawned upon me that perhaps many of us probably don't quite understand why it's so clear. And so I thought I'd start with just briefly reminding people why Tahoe is so clear from an ecological standpoint, but then give you, if I can, about 150 to 180 years of events leading to the changed ecosystem that we see today, and how we're moving towards the conservation of this 11th deepest lake in the world. And I do this because I think many of you have probably traveled to the lake like I do, but I think it's pretty important for us to remember history when we think about the ecology of a system and the people that have come before us and the change that's happened there. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the science stuff that we've been doing, and my colleagues and others. And so I'm using data from the Desert Research Institute and from UC Davis and others and University of Nevada. And I'm going to show you that some of the science data suggests that even with all those changes, you can recover a lake. And trying to use that science knowledge to make some change in public policies, especially related to aquatic invasive species introductions and preventing them from moving into the lake. And then finally, if you're not totally exhausted, I'm going to tell you at the end sort of the new issues related to climate that we're facing at the lake, just to spark some interest in these are changing times. And we need to be self-aware of them if we're going to make a positive difference in the future. And then finally, I'm going to reflect as I'm aging here now to think about just the reflections of science and why it's important. What does our future hold? And that'll just be a brief discussion. So my advisor who's in the room, Dr. Charles Goldman at UC Davis, started these pioneering studies up at Tahoe. And I always remember his work when I think about why this lake and other lakes in the world can be so clear and beautiful. And we owe the beauty of Lake Tahoe's remarkable clarity and the light that penetrates through the lake and the blueness of water to not just the physical properties, but the watershed itself. This granite watershed that we have within the lake is relatively nutrient poor. And then we used to have as well a nutrient poor watershed, nice big blue lake, but in the south end of Tahoe, we used to have a giant wetland there. Okay, the Upper Truckee Marsh. This was actually the largest mountain wetland in North America. So we had two things going on in the 1800s and prior to that period. We had a watershed that was relatively intact with its physics and its geology and low nutrient waters coming in that would stimulate little algal growth. But then we had a wetland here, for example, that would filter out the water from the watershed that delivers most of the nutrients to the lake. And this is essentially what you would have seen or what you do see when you go up to the lake, a nice, clean, clear blue water in many parts of the lake. And around the 1800s to early 1900s, mid-1800s to early 1900s, Tahoe underwent its first really massive human-oriented change that we know of. For those of you who are new to our region, it's important to remember this part of our history because it really affected the lake dramatically, as I'll show you in a second. Tahoe underwent a bunch of changes. Logging, the forest was virtually denuded, deforested, 80% plus of it. And those wood particles the wood went to prop up the Comstock mines. Can you hear me?
We're having trouble hearing a little bit.
Uh-oh, so okay. I'm going to keep talking. And so we also had the roads and species introduced. This is an example from Dr. Peter Goen at the University of Nevada showing these kind of reflective changes that you see within a watershed in the 1860s versus today. Shows you the watershed can bounce back, but with different species that are there. In the 1930s to the 1960s, we had a different era, an era when mountain living is occurring. There's slight increases in tourism, people visiting the lake. Then there's this post-World War II boom. Okay, the economy's booming, development is occurring, and we have the Olympics. Here's an example of the construction of highways that start occurring within the system. In 1936, start bringing more and more visitors to the lake. Okay, My colleague Julie Regan shared some photos with me. This is the 1920s beach scene on the west shore. You're getting more people to come up and find love at the lake, right? An exciting location to be. The Upper Truckee Marsh, that marsh I just showed you, the wetland in the south part of the lake that was the largest mountain wetland in North America, was developed. So here's the marsh in the south shore, and then here the Tahoe Keys development as of 1960, before the houses were in there. Here's a schematic. Live on an island in the sky, a conceptual diagram of homes placed along the Tahoe Keys. These incremental developments start changing that granite feature and the wetlands that we talk about for purifying the lake. South Shore builds with more roads, come more people, you have more watershed development. A bit different than we see it today, but still nonetheless changing. And there were even proposals. I don't know, how many of you remember this proposal? A proposal to build a bridge over Emerald Bay. Okay, these were the proposals of the time. We are a product of our culture and our time, and this was a grand time in the United States for thinking big. And building a bridge is a big idea across Emerald Bay. But these are the types of feelings we had around the lake. Let's develop the watershed. Let's promote access to this watershed. This did not occur, obviously, if you've been up to Emerald Bay. But then you'd have development that was, let's move dirt to the shoreline. Let's build jetties and put piers out at an uncontrollable, unsustainable rate. This is the 1960s, 50s, and 60s. In the 1960s, we had a seminal event, both for our country, but also for our region. We had the Winter Olympics. And the Winter Olympics is described in a book in the back. Thank you. So if you're interested in that period of time, all right. The world saw Tahoe in a different light, but so did people in our country. And this really brought another set of thinking about developing the watershed. And then, of course, casinos. The rush to build casinos in the 50s through the 70s. And with all of this development also comes, we don't quite have like we do today. We think about planning watersheds. And in those days, planning was not as large of a deal in terms of environmental sensitivities and maintenance. This shows you an example of that Upper Truckee River, where that marsh was at the time. In 1952, you'd see a nice sinusoidal river like you might see in Alaska or Russia and places that are not developed, trapping nutrients, providing habitat for organisms, moving through this giant wet and dry meadow. And then we see an airport channelizing the river. These are all things that we see today as well up there. They're legacies of the past, but they're part of the past of information that we need to live with, and we need to try to work towards resolving and mitigating. Okay, here's an example of that airport, and then how sinusoidal and meandering that Upper Truckee River was. By the early 1960s, we had an immense amount of growth. So for people who were younger in the room, there were far less people up in the watershed in the old days, but there were a lot more people coming in, okay, at an unsustainable rate. And in this case, what comes with people? Anybody? When you take something and you eat it? Yeah, you got to put it somewhere. And this is commonplace of the times, both in developed countries, but even today in developing countries where we work. You take that sewage and you pump it into lakes. Okay, you're moving nutrients into a lake. And this was absolutely a critical period for Lake Tahoe's time. The idea that sewage is going into a lake. And we had early pioneers like Dr. Charles Goldman, who's here, a limnologist, and other scientists saying, we have to come up with a way, and nonprofit groups saying, we have to come up with a way to moderate that development and to think about issues with sewage, and that was done. The idea that sewage is now exported out of the basin, some of it comes from South Lake Tahoe to Alpine County, and the ranchers use it there to grow alfalfa, for example, a big success story, or an agency is created to try to mitigate and manage bi-state issues, California, Nevada's growth, all right? And so this is truly, I think, the first bi-state solution to any major issue on the globe, and it's a very important one for our conservation legacy up at the lake. So that's my brief way of giving you 180 years of big change in maybe 15 slides, but it sure captures those critical moments that some of you felt in this room and some of your parents, and then definitely those of us who are working on the lake today see the legacy of those solutions that have been proposed, like pumping of the sewage, that have helped save the lake. So the question is, how do we deal with those changes? And did the lake really, how bad was it affected by the logging in the lake, or maybe the uncontrolled development? My colleague, Professor Alan Havert, at the Desert Research Institute, he goes out there, and Dr. Goldman, who's in the room, will notice that there's sedimentation coming from the watershed. This is the sediment in an old ship that was scuttled, and you can clearly see sediments accumulating within the bathroom of that ship. Well, if you could take that information, and limnologists do this, they take cores from the deep part of the lake, and you can reconstruct the history of time and ask, how badly is this lake changing? How much sediment does it receive over time? What are the conditions over time that might have promoted that sediment? This is an example of that science that went in, where they look at the rate of sedimentation over different periods. And remember that 1850s period I just talked about, the deforestation of Tahoe? You could see sedimentation rates were very, very steep and high at that time. But as soon as the forest grew back, lesson learned, you could at least change the sedimentation rate and slow it down a little bit. And then recently, there's another increase in sedimentation when we've developed the watershed in a very different way. I share this story with you because it offers a little hope. You can completely denude a forest in the Sierra Nevada, but if it recovers and you treat it right, you can also, the lake will respond in a positive way. So what are we doing now? Well, now, with both sedimentation studies, or in this case, Charles Goldman going out and saying, you know, we need to tie these changes in the lake to what's growing, or the watershed to what could grow in the lake. And doing these little bottle experiments, they go out, and this is for those of you in the back, this is the 1950s and 1960s. This is early data. And this is the growth of algae within the lake. You can see from 1950s into the 60s, this was an uncontrollable rate of growth in the system. So already in the 1950s and 60s, scientists were saying, hey, we got to do something in the watershed, and we got to do it pretty quickly with the watershed and sewage, or this lake will have a lot of algal growth, potentially exponential growth in the future. And indeed, what you see today is a long-term record of that growth. Nothing as steep as you might have predicted today, because the sewage was removed, the watershed plans were in place, but nonetheless, this is 1960 till today, same curve shape, not as extreme, but increased algal growth measured from the center of the lake. These are the studies that make Lake Tahoe famous, greater than 40-year record showing ecological change. Sure, it's algae, but it's little tiny critters responding at a rate that's like a canary in a coal mine. All right, here's the Secchi disk. This is a clarity measure over time. I'm sure you've seen these if you pay attention to the issues at Tahoe. But if you haven't, this is a dinner plate that's measured in the center of the lake to see how bad the clarity is changing. And indeed, in the 1960s, you could see 90 plus feet into the lake. And today, it may be plateauing out, but you can see around 60 feet or so. So clarity has declined. It's not what our parents or grandparents used to see, but nonetheless, it seems to be semi-stabilizing, but maybe it's too early to say for sure. A lot of the research has focused on measurements in the center of the lake. And one thing we know is that algae don't just grow from sediments coming into the lake that hold phosphorus, but they also grow if you add nitrogen. How many of you garden here? Raise your hands. I garden. I just worked on my garden yesterday. How many of you use Miracle-Gro? Admit it. Come on, people. All right. Or manure. All right. Some sort of fertilizer. What's in those fertilizers that allows your plants to grow? Okay. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. These are all the right combinations of nutrients for things to grow. And limnologists we figured out that algae need carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus at this ratio. Okay, it's called a Redfield ratio. And basically, if you have 16:1 nitrogen to phosphorus, then you can grow your algae at an optimal level. Lake Tahoe, if you take these little experimental studies, we used to be limited by the nutrient of nitrogen. In the past, up until about 1980, 81, and around 82, we saw a shift where the nutrients that are in your Miracle-Gro, for example, if we now add phosphorus, we can grow algae. Why did we shift those nutrients? One of the thoughts is we have a higher level of atmospheric pollution than we used to. So I know it doesn't seem like it would make a big difference, but those plumes of smoke that come through, or aerosols, affect the nitrogen balance, which have now shifted the limitation of the lake to phosphorus. There's nothing we can really do about that unless we solve regional pollution issues. That's one of those things where science can help at least inform that aspect. So these are studies done by UC Davis where they put these little bucket samplers out and they track the amount of nitrogen in the system and how it's deposited, and it changes from the east shore to the west shore of the lake, but most of it is coming from dry deposition from the watershed. So those of us who drive cars to Sacramento or we drive around Reno, our local air pollution here can influence what's happening up at the lake. Another reason, if we can, to take the Tahoe Tart once you get up to the lake, right? Minimize your airshed pollutions. What about that clarity? Is it all algae? Anybody? Water quality guys? Is it all algae that's causing that clarity to decline? No. It's the sediments. The watershed had changed. And the runoff and erosion that comes with changes in the watershed not only deliver nutrients in the sediments, but they deliver sediment themselves that affect the clarity. So at any given time in the year, the clarity is not only influenced by algae, but it is influenced by the erosional particles from the watershed. So what happens? You have increased algal growth, you have increased sedimentation. Are you as depressed as I am right now, right? Well, these are measurements that are done from the center of the lake, and we know they're falling to the bottom, so our group went out and used that long-term ecological data of algal growth, documented that the light was penetrating less over time with different types of instrumentation, not just that disk. And what we ended up finding, in short, is that algae is reducing the light that goes all the way to the deep bottom. Okay, so not just to 30 feet or 50 feet, but all the way down to 150, 110 feet within the lake. And that's changing the type of flows of energy that you have. Now you have less algae produced at 300 feet below the surface, and all this stuff that's growing is settling down. For fisheries folks, this starts changing where fish will eventually get their energy from material grown in the open water, not at the bottom. Turns out the plants at Lake Tahoe, they've evolved and they like just the right amount of sunlight and the right amount of nutrients. So here's an example of very important surveys done in the 1960s, showing in black where they used to catch plants. Mostly deep water plants were between 50 meters, 100 meters, maybe all the way down to 250 meters. 250 meters is 700 feet below the surface because there's the right amount of light penetrating to the bottom. That was the 1960s. We went back out in 2008 and 2009, and our students from the University of Nevada, it was really hard to find a plant. And there are very few plants growing, definitely none in the deep waters like there used to be. Okay, so I'm a gardener, and I ask myself, well, those are just lake plants. Do I really care, right? What's their role? It turns out these deep water lake plants, 300 feet below the surface, are really important habitat for organisms. Here's a short video. My colleagues at New Millennium Dive Expeditions out of Carson City work with us, and they've been instrumental in collecting data that we could not collect without special dive gear. So we're really grateful to have them. This is what it looks like 100, 150 feet below the surface. Okay, small weeds, but very important weeds. High density, lots of growth. The divers go down, take notes. They do plots for us, kind of like we do in the landscape if we're looking at weeds in Nevada. You can see particles, little bugs. Those of you like fish, there's a tiny fish there, not a big fish, but very important rearing habitat for lake trout, the bigger fish, and smaller fish within the system. So now you're getting a view of about 100 to 150 feet below the surface to 350 feet. This is the type of world that is under the waters of Lake Tahoe, but very important habitat. Well, today, if we go out and do these surveys with the divers, with funding from the agencies, we find there's only 2 plant patches left, really, maybe 3, in the whole lake. One's on the west shore, because the light has changed, we think, and the invasions that are there I'll talk about, and some in the south shore. So this is pretty important. Again, it's plants, but why is it important? Well, it turns out there are critters the size of a quarter and smaller that live at the bottom of this lake that are only found at Lake Tahoe, and they live in these plant beds. These are endemic native organisms. You can't find them anywhere else in the world. 2 blind amphipods, blind, Tahoe stonefly I'll talk about in a minute, ostracods, turbularians. These organisms are processing the watershed nutrients that are delivered from the watershed. They're keeping those nutrients from going back into the water column. Here's an example. Here's that 1960s data when our Nevada Department of Wildlife and Cal Fish and Game went out. They could catch these invertebrates all through the deep waters. Here's what we see today. Anything below 80 meters, approximately 230, 240 feet, is virtually gone. So this is the story of the bottom of Lake Tahoe that's changing quickly. Why am I concerned? Because these are native and endemic to our region. We'll find them in no other place on the globe. And things like the Tahoe stonefly, we get some nice bloggers who are super nerds, excited about stoneflies. These stoneflies are like the ones at Lake Baikal. They're wingless. They don't have a wing. They live their whole life cycle within this deep lake. Why are we also excited about it? These are one of the few stoneflies that give live birth. This is a mom crammed with eggs. Oh, I love mothers. You know, they're just fantastic. Thank your mother. And this is she rears the whole nymph, squeeze it all the way down. Here's one that's emerging. Very unique critters, only found in beautiful Lake Tahoe. What else is changing? Well, those are the endemic species only found there. But with that eutrophication, anybody know what eutrophication is? What is it, people? I know there's a water quality person in here. Yeah. With eutrophication, which is a natural process, but with cultural eutrophication, the addition of nutrients, the addition of particles that increase algal growth, we now see changes in the community of midges or mayflies. Again, these tiny little mayflies, like at first I started with my students, I thought, who cares? They're kind of mayflies, right? Well, it turns out if you can go to a mayfly and you can open its mouth parts up after you sample it, you can identify it to species. Some are predatory, some are eating algae, but these different mouth parts then signify the species. Some are more sensitive than others. And it turns out we are now increasing our diversity at the lake bottom with species that were not common in the 1960s. And we're losing the ones that were tolerant of cold, clear water. So is this a canary in the coal mine of change? The bottom is changing very quickly compared to those algal communities. So here's an example of that. We did some work in Mongolia and at Crater Lake up in Oregon, so 2 other large deep lakes. And we compared these communities and asked, where is Tahoe on the spectrum? It turns out in the 1960s, Tahoe was more like Crater Lake at the bottom. Very few midges and chironomids. They seem to love the cold water, very little food. But now we've moved past these lakes in Mongolia that are relatively pristine, and we have way more taxa than we used to have. So the bottom is changing pretty fast, at least in the 2 time periods we've measured. What else is changing in the lake? Over time, from the 1800s forward, Lake Tahoe and lakes in our region, we put species in the lake. And we add species because we think they'll benefit us largely. And sometimes, as I'll show you in a second, there are uncontrolled issues with the introduction of species. And this was very common. In the 1800s, we added rainbow trout, brown trout, and lake trout, Mackinaw from Lake Michigan. That's not a native species to Tahoe. Lake trout established around 1912. I'll tell you a story around that. Crayfish were introduced, kokanee salmon, so on and so forth. So let's go back to 1872. What was Lake Tahoe like in the 1800s? Even with all the forestry going on, the lake itself had a pretty simple food web. Pretty simple. There was 12 different types of invertebrates, the kind I just talked about, stoneflies, midges, plankton species that eat algae or each other, 2 to 5 aquatic plants, we're not quite sure, the taxonomy wasn't that great at that time, and 8 fish taxa, with 1 big game fish. Anybody know what the biggest game fish was? I know someone's at Pyramid today fishing. Lahontan cutthroat trout, yay, our state fish. All right, so this Lahontan cutthroat trout was indeed the large predator at Lake Tahoe, the largest game fish in North America. So before the species were introduced, we went back and we did chemical signature measurements from museum samples, where then we could reconstruct food webs. What we end up finding is this Lahontan cutthroat trout indeed fed mostly in the open water, and there was probably a food web that was relatively distinct from the open water. There were species that live on the edges of the lake. So an open water food web, simple food web. But by 1912, we had the establishment of Mackinaw, or lake trout, brought in from the Great Lakes. Something we call cultural imperialism, when you bring species from one place to move them to another. My mom brings jasmine plants, or used to, from India, because she missed jasmine plants, right? It's like, we do this, it's a cultural thing. These are Mackinaw that were sampled by our students who came from Russia, and they're about 22 to 24 inches long on average. They're really good predators. So Mackinaw, if you put them in a lake and they're feeding, they love to eat fish, cutthroat trout, maybe. Okay, so strong predation from the non-native lake trout, over-harvesting of the cutthroat trout, and the streams were still recovering from siltation in the watershed from forestry and hybridization with rainbow trout led to the extirpation of cutthroat trout. So the removal of cutthroat trout from our system by 1939. In 1959, if you go back to those museum samples, Mackinaw, those Great Lakes trout are now the top predator. But notice, where are they feeding? Are they feeding solely in the open water? No. They have restructured the architecture and the ecology of the lake. They're now feeding in the near shore and the offshore, near shore deep waters. All right. So lake trout are now implicated in this ecological change in the lake. What happened in the 50s and 60s, we were not getting as big Mackinaw as they had hoped for. And at the time, it was conventional wisdom to add species to a lake and to try to improve forage or growth of organisms. And I'll talk about the shrimp first, then the crayfish. So these guys, mysid shrimp, they're about the size of a quarter. They're called the opossum shrimp. Anybody know why? Look at those eyes, right? They are great visual predators. And they migrate every day 1,200 plus feet in the lake, migrate back up, migrate back down, and as grand visual predators, they eat the native organisms that filter out the water, Daphnia and Bosmina. And indeed, this is what happened in the 1960s to today. Here's the densities of the shrimp. First they boom, they oscillate on a 3 to 5 year cycle, and then you lose Daphnia. So those of you from 8th grade biology remember Daphnia are the water fleas. They're the ones we want in water for filtering algae. So these shrimp virtually eliminate our zooplankton taxa. But remember, they were put in to try to make bigger fish. Turns out the studies from the 70s suggest that, well, you can put the shrimp in, but it turns out they're competing with kokanee for those little Daphnia, not providing more food, and indeed, you end up seeing kokanee sizes shrink. So for those of us who are fishermen, we do talk about what if we can make these fish really big. Be wary of what you put into an ecosystem. There's unintended consequences when you introduce a shrimp. And you can go from 300,000 introduced to now hundreds of millions. And you can't remove them from the lake. So our fish kokanee sizes decline. What happens to the food web? What's Mackinac doing now? Anybody? Is it feeding in the nearshore? No, it's moved back into the open water zone. It's now feeding back where cutthroat trout used to be. So if we try to put cutthroat trout back in, we need to be very careful and mindful of where the food web structure and architecture is today. Notice that nothing's feeding on crayfish. I'll come back to that story now in a few minutes. Or right now, I guess. So crayfish are interesting. This is, how many of you have caught crayfish at Tahoe or in the Carson or the Truckee? Yeah. How do they taste? Good. They're high in omega-3s per unit mass, more than salmon. They're a great cold water organism, but they were introduced to our system in the 1800s, 4 times, established by 1936, 2 different subspecies at minimum. Here's some early data the UC Davis group collected. Here's historic, contemporary data, and our lab has continued to monitor them, and you basically see an increase in crayfish number. Notice that the numbers are really increasing in recent times, we think because of food web shifts and more algal growth, but that story is to be told. We need more students in here to come study that with us. We don't know exactly what's happening. Today, we see non-sanctioned introductions. By 1960, people had kind of figured out, okay, it's probably not a good idea to add species to the lake. So there was a nice good period between 1964, 66, until the mid-1980s, 1990s, that we didn't see any biological changes in the lake, at least with the bigger taxa. But this period of time represents the introduction of species that love to live on the edges of lakes, not in the open water. Bass, bluegill, water milfoil I'll talk about. Predatory smallmouth bass have been found. So we now have water milfoil, which is an invasive plant in other systems. And here's some data from our colleague Lars Anderson and some of our monitoring data that shows first it started in the South Shore and bits of the East Shore. And by today, it's now expanded all over the place. So why am I concerned about plants at Lake Tahoe? They do 2 things. They pump phosphorus from the sediments into the water column, so they can increase some of the nearshore algal growth. But from a fisheries side, I'm pretty interested because that nice clear habitat, look how structured it is now. It's a lot of algae, or a lot of plants growing here in parts of the lake. And now those plants are perfect habitat for our warm water taxa. They need plants to spawn. So we've seen some record goldfish there, bluegill, bass, crappie. All of these are now selected invasives that have been added to the lake. For those that are interested, here are the natives. So remember those 8-ish taxa from the 1800s? Most of them there except for the cutthroat trout and some sport fish. So here's the distribution now of the warm water fish. Notice the plants are green. They're in the South Shore, they're in the north, they're in the west. And the reds are where warm water fish are from time to time over our monitoring period, and you see a lot of overlap. So fish are also growing, not just because of plants, but temperatures of the near shore, we believe, are warming slightly less than the offshore. But we think they'll warm dramatically by 2099. This is just enough warming, as we published in the Journal of Climate Change, to allow bass and warm water fishes to proliferate. So these warm water fish usually don't like cold lakes, but if you change the temperature a half a degree Celsius, that's just enough to get them excited about spawning. And what do they like to eat? Crawdads. And what do we put in the 1800s? Crawdads, and they're all over the lake. And what are the plants doing? They're expanding around the lake. So this is sort of a trifecta. It's called invasion facilitation. When you have some invasives facilitate another, bass tend to grow, they eat native fishes, they release nutrients of nitrogen, phosphorus. Ironically, they release them near the Redfield ratio, so they can stimulate algal growth. Now, there's good news to every story, I should say. And the good news is largely these warm water fish are restricted to the Tahoe Keys and to marinas right now. It's still early in this invasion process. In some of the lakes in Canada, it's taken 100 years for them to move all around the lake, a much smaller lake. So again, science is knowledge here, and that knowledge can be used to try to manage these taxa into the future. What other invasions do we have? How many of you have heard of Asian clams? Yay, okay. So Asian clams are an interesting taxa. They too are about the size of a quarter. These little quarter-like organisms have big influences on lakes. And these Asian clams were introduced, or at least we detected them in the lake sometime around 2001, 2002. And they've been distributing themselves around the lake as they're expanding. Why are we worried? Remember this photo? This is that clear, cold, nearshore water that most of us get to see in certain parts of the lake. Sand Harbor would be one. When you put clams in an area, it turns out whether they die or they excrete nutrients, they too excrete at near this ratio, the Redfield ratio. So they're pooping out stuff, to put it politely, of nitrogen and phosphorus that causes algae to grow. And look what you see. Perfect algal growth in the nearshore. This is an undoctored photo of if you go kayaking in Marlet Bay in 2008, 2009, you could see pulses of algal growth. So the good news is we know that there's an invader there. We also know they're expanding slowly. The more difficult news to swallow is these are very difficult organisms to control without a large expense. So they're one of these things where knowledge is power. We now have this information and we need to understand where they would influence the lake and what to do. Now with warming, as you'll hear at the end of my talk again, with changing temperatures in lakes and changing seasons that we see with drought, crayfish love to grow when it's above 16 degrees Celsius. And indeed, when we do an analysis with warming scenarios, clams generally are in these densities around the lake, but we could easily see densities of 2,000 per meter squared. So 2,000 per area, maybe area of this pad. So things to look out for. So what do we do? I'm telling you a story now that some of you may be a little sad. I wouldn't be totally sad because knowledge is power here. What we've done, our colleague Marianne Whitman in her dissertation and papers tried to understand how are these invaders and where are they coming from? How do they get here? You know, some people say birds bring them in. Well, there's a significant amount of literature that also suggests humans matter, and in particularly boats. You can move species off trailers or off of boat bilge, and those get introduced into a lake. So her studies showed that if you put Tahoe as a center point and you interview people who are visiting, they're coming from all over the place. We know this already, but what we didn't know is that a lot of these places have invasives in them already. They're carrying an infection from Lake Mead or from Colorado lakes across Colorado to Tahoe. We're a destination. Okay, so this is a bit alarming, and we have to think about, well, that affects Tahoe, but how many of you have taken boats from Lake Tahoe and moved them to a neighboring water body? Pyramid Lake, Donner Lake, Walker. We can also infect other water bodies in our region. So what's great about this is we've taken our science knowledge and we've partnered with the agencies, the Regional Planning Agency, the Division of State Lands of Nevada, the California Fish and Wildlife, the Resource Conservation Districts, and we've developed a consortium to work together to prevent future invasive species introductions. And those of you can't see this too much in the back, but I want to point out 3 different things that are very important. Mandatory boat inspections started in about 2008 and a half, summertime, to try to get us thinking about making sure that we at least inspect the boats and or wash or quarantine them if they're bringing in invasives from other regions. The governors of California and Nevada signed a pact to try to work together because it is a bi-state issue because we're bringing invasives from across our states or our regions to this lake. We've set up little programs that some are successful, some pending, on encouraging privatization, commercial harvest of crayfish, for example, to try to get. We can't solve this problem just by throwing dollars at it. We need to encourage participation from the private community. Maybe we can harvest crayfish. And then we created plans that are based on science that the agencies utilize to now ask where should they be protecting the lake the most. Here's an example of that. Our two governors in 2009, or governor and the California Resources Secretary, signing a pledge, if you will, to work together to try to keep and develop an invasive species plan, keep them out of the lake. We've tried our best to take the science information to the policymakers. Every August, we have a Lake Tahoe summit. This is when our folks from California and Nevada and the federal authorities can come together. You know, some of them are patting themselves on the back, but others are really moving forward with this information, trying to protect our place. And our governors and senators have been really big champions of this science information. It's what I'm grateful for. We've had these prevention programs. Approximately 5,000 to 8,000 boats have been inspected per year. So since 2008, 2009, now you're talking, you know, what is that, 7 years now? 7 times 7, 49,000 boats-ish. That's a lot of effort. But it's inspections and decontaminating the boats that have infection on them, or invasions, or quarantining them if they're bad. We've tried our best. We have a little ski boat. Our students are on it, and they work on crayfish studies and so on and so forth. So we've brought Senator Heller out and other dignitaries to learn about crayfish. He was like, I didn't know crayfish were introduced. I'm like, yep, that's right. So will these introductions continue? Will these biological changes continue? I don't know. The good news is we have science that's been used to try to keep the lake from changing, at least biologically. And it's pretty effective, right? But then there are always these discoveries. What? I don't know. Some people see Tahoe Tessie sometime, right? You can always see these fascinating things. And don't discount, that's a hypothesis, right? That's great. We should be going out to test whether Tahoe Tessie's there. Well, we'll have to let Dr. Goldman talk about Tahoe Tessie. He's got UFO, unidentified fishing objects, swimming objects, USOs, in lakes. But one thing we do know is that people do really foolish things. And this is a case where we got a report in 2014. I've seen something at the lake. I don't know what it is. Well, what does it look like? Looks like a shark. What do you mean it looks like a shark? Okay. And then what ends up going back and forth is we send photos around, and it turns out somebody introduced from an aquarium a skate into Lake Tahoe. Okay? A shark. Can you believe that? A shark in Tahoe? The good news is this is likely a saltwater species. It won't survive in the lake. That's also the bad news for the shark. But it is a sign that there's enough. We need to do more education to try to get people from just putting things into our lake, because these things can cause a lot of change. Okay, so I want to leave you with some new insights, not just the ecological changes that are happening. I'm a firm believer that knowledge is power. We can utilize that to make a difference if we do it in the right way and productively. But there are things that are on the horizon, and they're very important things. The shift in climate is a dramatic global change. It's also, as you know, affected our region. It doesn't just affect our agricultural crops. It doesn't just affect whether we get to kayak in the Truckee River or go fishing, but it affects the ecology of our systems. And this is one of those things that scientists now, with the advent of satellite technology, are able to detect. These things called atmospheric rivers, big storms that are coming off the Pacific that dump. Guess where they dump? Right in the Central California, Oregon area. These are basically masses of precipitation that come down, sometimes warm, making a big difference in our snowpack, as you know, from this last season. We can have a lot of snow, but if it rains right after, all that water runs right into the waters. And so what's happening is this shifting climate is resulting, and may be resulting in larger atmospheric rivers. But our colleague, Dr. Adrian Harpold at University of Nevada, just got hired, and he and a fellow, Mike Dettinger from the U.S. Geological Survey, we're lucky to have Mike at the university now, they have come up with this idea that the West is being influenced by a new concept. It's not drought, it's actually snow drought. Now, it's a little semantics, but it's not quite. It's the idea that we used to worry about the lack of winter precipitation, but as you know, this year, we get some great snowstorms, and skiing is back up, and my back hurts from shoveling. It's a lot of work, But now we're getting rain, or those big rivers, atmospheric rivers, rain on snow events that are washing that water out, making it not available for later in the summer. This is going to affect the ecology of the lake, and we don't quite understand those interactions. These are the new science questions, the physics of water, where it gets placed into the system, and how it affects the lake. And Dr. Harpold is the leader of this type of idea, and it's being transferred all throughout the western United States. It's an important thing for us in the West. So where are we these days? After hearing a talk like this, you could get really pessimistic. And one should be a little pessimistic. But there's also an opportunity. We live in a time where we have more information than we've ever had. And a lot of it is good science information. A lot of it is out there for people to utilize to make change. And so my question would be, would you like to be like this artist in Ecuador named Guayasamín and have, as I feel sometimes, this frantic look? This change is happening, right? Is the fifth horseman of the apocalypse here? This is Dr. Charles Goldman's idea of maybe indeed water is this next fifth horseman. The idea that we have droughts and poor water quality. These are changing times. We could go down these paths, and indeed the fifth horseman may be here around water. But we also live in a time where we have local solutions and local contexts. The idea that you can inspect boats or at least educate people not to put species into a lake. The idea that we know algae is growing and we know it changed because of changes in these nutrient ratios, and we need to restore the watershed. To me, this knowledge is really critical for making change. And at least as someone at the University of Nevada and in our region, I want to use that science and help people make the decision around conserving Lake Tahoe. So we've tried to do a couple new things. This is kind of a fun one. Not just collecting science knowledge, but let's geek out. Kids are playing video games these days. Great. Let's get them playing video games, but developing tools that allow us to understand the changes at Lake Tahoe at a scale that I could never have done. So we have an autonomous program at the University of Nevada. Our group has been working with them to develop a 5-foot boat that can go out and sense the edge of the lake, collect data in this moment of time around the clarity of water, collect it around the species that are there, use the new tools and the new technologies that are available to report back, and use them with devices that are small or cheap. We're trying to go for an $8,000 to $10,000 sensor, so if it breaks in the middle of the lake, it's cheaper than one graduate student, put it that way, going out there, all right? And so these are the types of visuals we get with the NASIC program at the university. We're basically having a boat profile, we want to have a boat profile the nearshore area of the lake where we think there may be more algal growth or bass or plants. So this is an example of that type of tools development. It's a great period to live right now. And with technologies like this, I don't think I could have done this 20 years ago for cheap. So pre-programmed, kind of fun. You'll see in a second, I'm going to try to move it up here. This is near Fanny Bridge at the outflow of Tahoe. It can move rather rapidly and detect for plants, for example, or algal growth. So for the youngsters in here, this is a great time to live. Use your technological skills and your video gaming skills. Use your know-how, and let's build tools that will allow us to sense the environment and come up with more solutions. Okay. On that note, I want to thank a few people that are here. I have colleagues from the university. My old advisor, Charles Goldman from UC Davis, who's a Nevada resident, and Nancy are here. Thanks for coming. Julie Regan, I hope she's here. She gave me and allowed me to use a lot of these slides from the Regional Planning Agency. The funding for these types of projects, it's something I'd like to recognize. Nevada's made a grand contribution through Division of State Lands and DEP, Division of Environmental Protection, and through something called the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act. Federal lands that are sold in Vegas, and those monies are used to protect and understand changes at Tahoe. and of course the Regional Planning Agency and the College of Science at the University of Nevada. So Nevada State Museum, thank you. This has been a totally entertaining talk for me. I got to give it, so that's fun. I hope you enjoyed it too. Please keep educating your members about change in our region and what we can do to solve these problems. And members and friends, don't forget to donate to this great museum. It's in our backyard. Now I want to end with you on my personal angsty reflection. Anybody know what this is? I was at a Discover Science talk at the university last week, and I was kind of blown away. Anybody? It looks like an aerial photograph. It is. It's this thing called Voyager, which I didn't know too much about, looking back at the planet Earth, the little blue dot that Carl Sagan talks about. And to me, when I heard this talk last week by this lady from NASA, who gave this fantastic talk in the College of Science lecture series, public lecture series, it made me realize if they can come up with tools like Voyager to look back on this, our planet, then we easily should be able to come up with tools and knowledge to solve Lake Tahoe's problem.
Is that little white dot on planet?
That's the Earth. Isn't that crazy? From like all the way somewhere way out there and not even know where the planet is.
You're talking about that little white dot.
Yeah. It took a photograph of it.
But what's all the colors?
Oh, I have no idea. I'm not a physicist. But come on, we can send something in the 80s and 90s into space to look back on us. Then we should be able to solve our problems at Lake Tahoe fairly easily. So I want to encourage all of you to help do that. Thank you. So I can take a few questions. Yes?
Yes, so the obvious question is, are you working with NASA on remote sensing?
Yeah, so the question was, are scientists working with NASA or Jet Propulsion Labs, for example, utilizing tools like remote sensing to look at change? Yes. Our colleagues at UC Davis have been partnering with Jet Propulsion Labs and NASA, and they have buoys on Lake Tahoe that are at the actual calibrations to some of the satellites because it's high enough in elevation. But then we've utilized some of the satellite data to try to look at skin temperature changes in the near shore and make relationships. The other thing we're doing is we just launched a project in Cambodia, for example, with the University of Nevada and the US government. And the Mekong River there is so big, it's so vast, that we're now partnering with NASA and trying to pull images to look at fishing pressure of boats on this river. Or another place in Northern California, using Google Earth Engine and NASA products that go into Google Earth Engine to count dead trees in lakes because they're changing the habitat in some of the upper Sacramento lakes. We have more drought, more fire, and those trees have to go somewhere. So we're trying to ask what those trees mean for lakes. So remote sensing is a great tool for the future, but don't forget you got to get in the field to calibrate the data, right? Yeah.
You said that your research also has an impact on policy. So is there any work to take your data or other people's data and reduce erosion running into Lake Tahoe?
There is a lot of work, and that is perhaps what the last 20 years plus years of Tahoe research is focused on, where the data that has come out suggests about 50% of the clarity loss is due to sediment erosion. Some of that erosion comes from historical legacies, for example, up some of the canyons where there was forestry and we need to reforest or manage those systems a little better. But some of it related to runoff of roads, particles off of roads, runoff off of, and so creating basins for containing the sediment and settling them before they go to the lake. So I'd say most of the research from the late 80s, probably early 90s into the 2000s is focused on the sediment erosion work. And there's still a lot of work to be left to be done. Yeah.
You have probably some attacks of grazers or planktonic eating fish. Are any of those still there, and are they in numbers as they were before the great fishing occurred in the 1880s to the early 1900s?
Great. So the question is there any of those grazing taxa and also native fish taxa is still there from the old days, right? Yeah. And this is the coolest thing about species invasions. For whatever reason, in most lakes, you can introduce species, but it generally doesn't change the fish community. It doesn't change the composition, it changes the numbers. So the great news, if there is good news to any story, other than the Lahontan cutthroat trout, we still have the whole complement of fishes in Lake Tahoe. The bad news is that some of those species have been reduced dramatically. And we don't understand why completely, but we suspect it has something to do with the other invasions. Or maybe the Mackinac feeding on them. But the good news is they're all there.
Would they have a clean lake?
Yes. So, for example, one of those taxa. Ooh, that's exciting, actually. One of those taxa is a benthic organism, a bottom-living organism, called the Tahoe sucker, aptly named, right? And this Tahoe sucker is a bottom-feeding organism that actually would feed on invertebrates and algae. So that, in terms of a lake cleaner on the bottom, could be a very important fish for controlling nearshore algal growth. Those types of studies mechanically we haven't worked on yet, but we would suggest that could be true. The other thing that could be important, I guess, these cold water fish, the Paiute sculpin, these are deep water, generally mid to deep water living species. We haven't caught one of those in 20 years. We don't have a regular monitoring program for fish, but most of these taxa, chubs and sculpin, are missing from our monitorings. They're there intermittently, but their numbers are very, very low. Question?
I was wondering exactly what the ash content from all the forest fires that we're having, how is that?
Yeah, it is a very good question. We published a paper last year with some colleagues from Miami University talking about the importance of forest ash on lakes in the western region. There's some data I can't show you here, I don't have it with me, but the idea that ash can intercept ultraviolet light because it has organic carbon in it, and that ultraviolet light then may shift the composition of the organisms. Non-natives, when it has low ultraviolet light, love to grow. Natives have sunblock, and they're like, hey, we like the ultraviolet light. So that ash is one aspect of where it can change the food web. But the other thing that's very interesting, and Dr. Goldman, I might have to ask you to help me here, but I believe in the 80s, you guys had forest fires in Southern California with that smoke coming up. And some of that smoke influenced the algal and clarity measurements here.
Actually, it did two things. It reduced the ultraviolet inhibition of algal growth near the surface, and at the same time it fertilized the lake, particularly with iron. And as a result, we had the highest productivity ever measured when there was the least light at the base.
So it can have an effect by stimulating some of the algal growth by changing the light inhibitions and allowing them to grow, because we're in these really intense light areas, and providing nutrients. The delicate balance these days is trying to understand at what direction is it really. You know, I mean, it may not all be bad, for example.
So it could be helping in some kind of way?
It could be helping on the algal growth side and changing on the clarity side, but it could be stimulating food for some of the critters that I was talking about. And so where is that balance? Yep.
I heard that that mats were being used to smother the clams and the mussel growth on the lake floor. Is that still being done, and how successful is it?
Yeah, so the question is, she had heard that whether mats are being used to smother the clams on the lake bottom. So we were seeing the rapid proliferation of clams, and indeed, I'm trying to see if I have any photographs. What now? Oh, yeah, I'm trying to see if I have any at the end. Oh, no, I don't have them. So indeed, those mats, we used small mats first, and we were smothering the clams, and the oxygen below the mats killed the clams. That was great. Then we scaled it up to a big acreage, and it worked. And then we took it to Emerald Bay. And at Emerald Bay's sill, which is complicated, the sediments there, the water flows through the bottom sediments into the lake. It keeps the mat oxygenated at the bottom, so we weren't killing as many in a 30-day period. If you leave the mats there for a year, I think, year and a half, maybe 14 months, then you're starving the clams, and it seemed to work. The trick with the mats is it works, but probably only in localized patches. The clams reproduce really fast. So I know there's some discussion on whether we should be doing this now because there's clams at Sand Harbor or Emerald. I think that's a tough call for the management community. Yeah.
Are we still stocking Lake Tahoe with fish?
Oh, great question. I talk about all these introductions. Are we still stocking Lake Tahoe with fish? Nevada used to stock with rainbow trout, I believe, for catching and collection. I don't know if they stock the main lake anymore. And I think part of that reason is there's a tendency, and they're trying to collaborate to try to figure out what to do with cutthroat trout, but I can't remember if that's the sole reason.
The fish that we have left in the lake, are they reproducing
Yeah.
and flourishing?
That's right. So those Mackinac, the lake trout, they tend to spawn on those weed beds I talked about. The rainbow trout utilize the ones that are in the lake, and brown trout utilize the streams, mostly Taylor Creek at the south end of the lake. And I actually might ask my colleague Julie to put her on the spot if she's here. Are they still stocking kokanee fry, or is that kind of stopped, Julie?
Julie Reagan?
Yep, in the back.
Actually, the Nevada Division of Department of Wildlife actually just stocked the hunt and cutthroat trout a couple of years ago, just purely for sport, near Cave Rock. I'm not sure about the other fish, but
Yeah.
that got everyone's attention.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the kokanee, I don't think, so the cutthroat trout were being stocked to do catching and release, or catching, but I don't think the kokanee are either. It's a totally different time for the agencies up there. They're thinking in different progressive ways.
I think the kokanee are naturally spawning.
In Taylor probably, and in some of the springs.
And several others as well.
Yeah. So did you hear that? So the kokanee may be naturally spawning. They probably are because you see them in the lake and things like that.
I have one more question.
Sure.
With the amount of precipitation that's come in this last year and this year, how is that going to affect the spawning in Taylor Creek? Is the water so high, or does it make a difference?
The good thing about kokanee is they're fall spawners. So the good news for them is it's going to be high water, but it's not going to be, well, I don't know. It may not be raging. And then Falling Leaf Lake is also controlled by that dam that's there. And that's where most of the spawning occurs for kokanee, if they do stream spawning. Yeah, it's a really interesting year. I mean, this much water coming in at one big pulse. What does that mean for the nearshore? I have a question for you. Do you guys, when you walk around the nearshore of Lake Tahoe, winter or summers, do you see changes in algal growth? Are you noticing anything, or are there patches that you've been to at Sand Harbor where you're like, oh no, it's always the same?
Yes.
You are noticing changes. So are you noticing growth of algae?
Yes.
Anyone not noticing changes where they are in the lake? This is kind of an important, right, science guys? We like to have sites that aren't changing. Any places that you visited where you're like, hey, you know, things haven't been changing that much? Okay, data point. Yeah.
Rubicon Bay doesn't seem to be changing terribly much.
Okay, so
And maybe it's because the water there is so deep.
okay, so Rubicon Bay's near shore doesn't seem to be changing as much from your observations, and maybe because it's deep water.
There's an app for smartphones that allows citizens to report what you see, so we collect the larger information.
Absolutely. So there's an app for smartphones. Can you tell us a little bit about that app?
Well, it is. I'm a docent there.
I know.
Let me answer another question now.
Okay, so he's going to pull up an app on smartphones that allow us to take photographs and sort of track change. UC Davis and others have been leading this, so this is very important for citizens to participate. Yep.
I think because we live in Carson City, most of us here are East Shore people. This is where we swim and recreate a lot. And that seems to be the more shallow waters that are clearly, you can see the green out
Okay.
on the rocks.
So more in the shallow waters, even on the east shore, though.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed.
Okay. Your agencies came up with a working group of scientists from Desert Research Institute, UNR, UC Davis, USGS. We invited experts from Ball State University who are experts in algal ecology in the end of January to participate in is the nearshore changing for periphyte or algal growth, and what would cause it? Some of what came out is the idea that maybe in shallow waters, you get the warming of water. Some of it is, don't forget, lakes mix. And when they mix, they transport their nutrients. So the movement and the physics of the lake probably matters and how water moves. My little critters like crayfish and bass could be playing a role by excreting nutrients at the red field. And then another one that came up that I thought was kind of interesting is our work in the West Shore with USGS suggests old groundwater legacies might come through. And we used to think that there's very little groundwater that comes to Lake Tahoe. And that's true at the annual scale. There's lots of snow, right? Little groundwater, but lots of snow melt. But maybe the groundwater comes in at the right time and it goes subsurface and picks up nutrients. So the good news is the agencies are on it, and they're asking the scientists to try to help out.
Are they currently commercially fishing crayfish at the lake or not?
To my knowledge, they're not. I had a conversation with our colleague from the Regional Planning Agency who's in charge of aquatic invasive species this morning, and he does not know of any commercial harvest of crayfish currently.
One guy tried it, and I don't think he very successful.
Correct.
The people were actually stealing his ponds.
Professionals there,
Yep.
fishing, people were stealing ponds. Lake Tahoe is one part of a closed system. You got the Truckee River, Lake Tahoe, and Pyramid Lake. You know, I don't think you can probably effectively manage by just taking one isolated part of it and just trying to manage it. Is there been studies or an attempt to look at a comprehensive management within the whole system? Truckee, Lake Tahoe, and Pyramid Lake?
So a great question. I wish you were a student in my lab, because has there been a comprehensive way of looking at the management of Lake Tahoe and its whole watershed, Truckee and Pyramid? So really the Pyramid watershed we're talking about. It's a tricky question for me to answer, is because quite honestly, biologically, no. I don't think in a way that's really fundamentally effective to understanding the ecological changes in the system. Water quantity-wise, kudos to our Nevada senators and politicians mixed with local partners that came up with this Truckee River operating agreement. So for water quantity, I have to say when I'm on a road show going to other countries, I talk to them about two great things about our region for science and water. The exportation of sewage to protect a lake is fundamentally one of the greatest engineering feats that I cannot try to I'm trying to replicate in other parts of the world. Number two, TROA, Truckee River Operating Agreement, partners actually coming together, including the tribe, trying to figure out what they're willing to live with to get water flows to Pyramid Lake. That, at least from a water quantity and partial quality standpoint, it's a success. It appears to be a success. Great question. You should come work for me in my lab. That's yeah.
You may have answered this already, but with this year's water supply, how will that affect the lake?
Yeah, so how will this year's water supply, or just flushing of water that's coming down, influence the lake? There's a couple ways. In the past, when you'd see this much water forcing down at the different time of year in the properties of the lake, you can affect the actual turnover of the lake. So physically, you could affect a mixing process that might allow nutrients from the bottom to come back into the water column. That would cause algal growth. It might be delayed, but it would occur. The second way, depending on timing, is you're raising the lake level dramatically, right? And you're raising this level, and depending on where it goes, you're making more available habitat for the organisms that I'm interested in. I think looking at those types of questions in a one-year framework is difficult, because the lake level rises and the critters are just like, woohoo! It's like, it's a party. But at the same time, the algal growth may not catch up till the winter of the next year. So there's these delays in how the organisms respond, and then that next year might be better. So there's these complications. So I think the water supply issue is the lake level rising it's something with these climate change issues, snow drought. It's something we don't have a good handle on, not just at Tahoe, but other lakes. This is a very different era we live in. Big rises, drawdowns for 4 years, big rises. These are big disturbances. Ask me in 10 years. Because I wish I knew. I mean, lakes around the globe are feeling this atmospheric river or big watershed disturbance from rain. And lake levels are going up, or in droughts, they're dropping dramatically. And ecologists, we've only just started to understand processes in the nearshore.
Well, then, this water supply, I mean, a lot of that will be snow. And that's a whole different, isn't that a whole different ballgame?
Yeah, so he's saying, well, a lot of this water supply will be snow. Well, in the old days, it was snow. It was snow. It was snow that would come and slowly percolate through the system in the spring thaw. So we could cross-country ski into May, the snow would melt, and the rivers would stay flush through June. But now we're getting these events with rain on snow. And the timing now of that supply will be important. If we get warm rains on snow next week, that snowpack flushes quickly. And that water that's available may not be available for summer. So it's a crazy global time for us. These are changes that are happening more and more. So it's not just the snow itself is what I'm suggesting, and it's when it comes to the water. This is why I think the work of the university, hiring people like Dr. Harpold, or the Paul Verbergs, or these new generations of scientists are trying to get a handle on that disturbance of snow when it comes in lakes or streams. I wish I had a better answer.
Well, the snow, depending on what it is, whether it's snow or whether it's water that's flushing
As rainwater.
nutrients out of the ground, out of the groundwater.
Yep.
In the mountains surrounding the lake.
Yeah. I'll end with this. What happened with our colleagues, I don't want to spill the beans from our colleagues at Carson City USGS, but we're working on earlier last winter, we had a snow. Small snow, but then we had a rain on snow. That rain pushed that water through the groundwater, and the groundwater had lots of nitrogen, and it caused the winter algae to bloom in the West Shore. And that was I think we were out there in December and January. And it should have been melting in April and May. So I think the quality will change with time. Well, I would like, and there's one last thing on the app. What app do we want our citizens to sign?
One UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center website, TURP, Citizen Science App.
Excellent. And you can report what you're seeing at the lake on the UC Davis Citizen Science app, photographs of change, algal growth. Those of you that have smartphones, try it. All right. Thank you very much. Have a good night.